So, Lucy, I want to get on to astrobiology. Let me start by asking you how you got into your field, though, of research.
Well, when I was an undergraduate at Rice University, I was double majoring in physics and chemistry. And I took astronomy courses as my physics class options. And so I kind of had this interest in all these topics. And, I was a senior and I was like, what am I going to go to graduate school? Am I going to go in physics or am I going to go in chemistry? And then I read an article about the discovery of ammonia and water and some of the first new molecules out in space. And when I read this article, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the most really exciting thing I've ever seen. And it really combines everything I'm interested in. And so that was my goal since then, was to, get into the field of molecular astrophysics and interstellar molecules astrochemistry. Now, there really wasn't astrochemistry in existence at the time, so it was kind of, I really want to study these things, so I'm going to have to kind of come up with what I think I need to get into the field. So I went to the Max Planck Institute for Radio Astronomy for 2 years before I went to graduate school, and in graduate school I did a lot of work in the laboratory with microwave spectroscopy.
So for people who can't see the connection,
Right.
to talk about why you need radio astronomy to study molecules in space.
How else are you going to study molecules in space? That's the major avenue by which you can detect them. Using radio astronomy, you can find out what molecules are out there, the quantities, where they exist, and what radio telescopes do is that they measure their rotational spectra. And every single chemical compound has a unique rotational spectrum because every chemical compound has different masses of the atoms and different bond lengths. And so they rotate, they have different moments of inertia, so they rotate at different rates. And what we detect is the change in how fast they rotate, which is quantized. And so we look at rotational transitions, energy level differences. Molecules are typically collisionally excited up to higher levels, and then they just spontaneously decay and emit photons. And we can go to the radio telescope and detect those photons, which come out at precise frequencies. And with the radio telescope, you can tune exactly to those frequencies, like tuning a radio.
There must be some there must be some good technologies involved, because, radio astronomy is 80 or 90 years old, but this field matured later than that. There must have been some technology there.
At first, people were interested in just looking at radio signals over a broad frequency range in the continuum. But with the development of actually radar and then microwave spectroscopy in the late 1950s and early 60s, Charles Towns was involved in this a lot. People began to realize that you could actually tune your receiver, your detector to a specific frequency range and couple it with a spectrometer back-end spectrometer system and actually measure spectra with very high resolution, as good as 1 part in 10 to the 7th, 10 to the 8th.
Right.
And that started in the late 1960s, and in 1971, CO, carbon monoxide, was discovered, which was the big breakthrough in our understanding of interstellar molecules, and it was actually discovered at the old 36-foot telescope on Kitt Peak.
Wow.
So, yeah, and as technology has advanced in that area, the area of heterodyne receivers, we've gained more and more sensitivity as time has gone on.
And I lose track of the number of different molecules that have now been found in interstellar.
It's about 150, 160.
Which is amazing. And
Yes.
What's the maximum complexity of the molecules?
Well, I think the most complex one now is HC11N. That has 13 atoms. It's a very strange molecule. It consists of acetylene sort of pieced together such that in the end you have 11 carbons. But we've also seen things that are more organic in nature. Acetamide is out there. It's got a peptide bond. Formic acid, acetic acid, dimethyl ether, ethanol. A lot of these sort of basic organic compounds are out there, and very often in quite large quantities.
Now, people think of space as just a boring vacuum. How do molecules like this form in what is still pretty close to a vacuum?
Well, they form in the denser regions of the interstellar medium, which is typically 10 to the 4th, 10 to the 7th particles per cc. And Well, this is a little bit more complicated. A lot of them form in molecular clouds, and they form via what we call ion molecule reactions. And an ion, a charged particle, will react with a neutral particle and create a molecule. And usually you have to start with two bodies and end with two bodies to take away the energy of the collisions. And these are particularly fast reactions. They don't have activation energy barriers, which most reactions on Earth have, and they only involve two bodies instead of three bodies. And they pretty much, a good fraction of them proceed at the collisional rate. So every collision results in a reaction. And these ion molecule reactions are sufficiently fast at interstellar conditions to create more complex molecular species. Now, molecules also form in the atmospheres of stars, where the temperatures and the densities are a lot higher, where when stars get old, they start losing mass, and material flows from the atmosphere, and it's pretty dense. Three bodies collisions can occur, and it's maybe a few thousand degrees, and then you get a lot of more common, gas phase chemistry at thermodynamic equilibrium. Mm-hmm. And those molecules flow out from the star, and then other reactions can occur, but those are sort of the two basic ways molecules are formed in interstellar space, we think.
And knowing just from a theoretical standpoint, is there a limit to the complexity of a molecule that could form in this environment?
That's a good question. We don't know.
Okay, so this is still a very observationally driven field.
Yes, and of course, the larger the molecule, the more complicated its spectrum, the more emission lines it generates, and the harder it is because of spectral line confusion. Mm-hmm. We're at the point where many spectra from many molecular clouds are simply wall-to-wall lines.
Wow.
It gets really difficult to discern what's out there. So we may be limited by just the technique as to how complex a molecule we can detect. Mm-hmm. But it's,
That's a good situation, though, for an astronomer to be in. Yes. Too much information.
Yes, exactly.
So let's segue from astrochemistry to astrobiology. What can we say about the ingredients for life? Do we really think they're everywhere and more or less the same everywhere?
Well, we see organic molecules, meaning molecules based on the chemistry of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, all through our galaxy and in external galaxies. And organic chemistry, of course, is the chemistry that produces life. And so the basic ingredients are out there. As I said, we see things with the famous peptide bond, mm-hmm. which are important in proteins. We see the kind of functional groups that are seen in biomolecules, carbonyl groups, acid groups, things like that. The question is, how complex can interstellar chemistry get? Can it produce a real biomolecule, mm-hmm. such as a nucleoside or a nucleotide mm-hmm. in DNA and RNA? Can it produce a more complex function of a protein? Right. We don't know that. But the basic ingredients are out there, and they're being produced pretty much in the gas phase with some surface reactions. We know a little bit about how complex molecules can get by meteoritic studies. And there's groups of people that extract organic material from meteorites, and they find much more complex species than we've seen in space, including some polypeptides. They see like 100 and some amino acids in these meteorites and so forth. And you might say, well, those just form on the meteorite and the pre-solar nebula, but a lot of these molecules are known to have interstellar origin because they're highly deuterated, and they have very high deuterium to hydrogen ratios, and you only get high deuterium to hydrogen ratios if the molecule forms in a cold environment and stays cold. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the deuterium will quickly exchange for a hydrogen. So I would say that, yes, the ingredients for life is present throughout our galaxy and possibly in external galaxies. It's just there's a lot of steps to go between some organic molecules and a living system.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the big gap.
Maybe we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Let me just ask a sidebar about water. So, NASA follows the water to look for life in the solar system. We're in the, spectrum of abundance of molecules. Where does water lie?
Oh, water's a little difficult to study because it's often seen as a maser. Okay. But its abundance from what we know, is typically about 10 to the 6th, 10 to the 7th relative to molecular hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
it's fairly, fairly abundant for an interstellar molecule, maybe in the top 10, 15 most
Right.
abundant molecules.
Right. And well, before we leave the subject of complexity in the interstellar medium, we have to give a nod to Fred Hoyle and the dark cloud.
Yes.
So science fiction has already been there speculating, and that is pretty much implausible, right? I mean, these low density environment and interactions are very unlikely to lead to a replicating molecule or.
Well, probably not, but we don't know for sure. Every time we look at molecules, a few years goes by and then something else pops up that's completely unexpected. Whether the chemistry out in interstellar space can lead to a living system is probably unlikely, but we can never be 100% for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, it's always good to keep the door ajar a little bit. So I remember in a paper that I imagine was quite influential, Norm Pace, Universal Biochemistry. Yes. Is that a plausible argument that biochemistry everywhere will have the same basis?
well, we probably see that the basis for most chemistry out in space is organic, is based on carbon. But that doesn't mean that, well, everyone thinks about silicon-based life, and I can't really say that that's impossible. But most likely life is based on carbon, but the details could differ. There's a fellow by the name of Steve Benner who kind of takes DNA and puts in different things for the sugars or for the bases that join the strands. And some other compounds seem to work just fine. Our hemoglobin is based on iron, but maybe it could be based on something like cobalt. So there are, possibilities that things could be somewhat different, although probably it'll be carbon-based and involve the basic bonds to carbon. So,
And carbon has pretty special chemical properties,
yes,
right?
yes, because it can, sp3 hybridize and bond all different things in unique ways and very strong directional bonds,
Right.
which is the problem with silicon.
So from perspective you came to it, what attracts you about astrobiology?
Well, there's so much chemistry going on in interstellar space. It's hard to think that, the chemistry that led to life on planets is completely disconnected. And the thing that interested me about astrobiology is, how much does interstellar chemistry influence the origin of life on planet surfaces? And, there's many paradoxes in looking at the biochemistry of the origin of life. I mean, why only a certain number of amino acids? Why only the certain base pairs in DNA and RNA? Why ribose as part of deoxyribose nucleic acid, DNA and RNA? People don't know why. It's clear that other sugars would work, other different compounds of those sorts would work. So why was nature had such strong preferences for certain things? Well, that could probably be a result of what was delivered to Earth that started things in the first place. And I don't know, from what I've read and what I've studied, it seems like Earth lost almost all its early carbon in the form of methane, oxygen, CO2, CO atmosphere. And if you look at the Earth's early crust, there's very little evidence for any carbon. So if the carbon had to be brought back exogenously, then the big question is, in what form did that carbon come? Were certain compounds just more available than others? Because, and that was what was deposited on Earth, and that's why things led the way they did. And why would certain compounds be more prevalent than others? Well, interstellar chemistry isn't thermodynamically controlled. It's pretty much kinetically controlled, which means that only certain pathways are allowed because of the low temperature, low density environment. And so you can imagine the kinetic chemistry leading to certain types of compounds, but not everything. And maybe that influenced what specifically got delivered to Earth and perhaps other planetary systems, and that influenced how the biochemistry evolved.
So, I mean, that's very interesting what you said, because the delivery of the organic material. So does that say something about how early life could have started on Earth? Because people really don't know, I suppose. But
Well, I think it's thought that life began after this period of late heavy bombardment, which was 3.4 to 3.6 gigayears ago. And so Earth went through a period where, things condensed out and cooled down and the bombardment settled down. And then at this epoch, the bombardment increased by an order of magnitude. And it's thought shortly thereafter that the initial, the basic life forms started evolving.
mm-hmm.
So,
Another chemical ingredient, and I don't know the chemistry of it, but phosphorus is pretty important for life as in
Yes.
the energy storing molecules. And I think the cosmic abundance of phosphorus is pretty low. So
2 times 10 to the minus 7th relative
right.
to
So
cosmically.
where did the phosphorus come from? Is that is that a question? Is that a research
Yes,
issue?
it is a very interesting question, and that's sort of encouraged us to look for phosphorus-containing molecules out in interstellar space, and we have found in the past few years a few more, including PO with phosphorus
mm-hmm.
bonded to oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
The one nice thing about phosphorus is it's not it's only somewhat refractory, so it doesn't necessarily condense into grains, so some of it gets into the gas phase. In terms of phosphorus being delivered to Earth, they do see some phosphonic acids in meteorites,
mm-hmm.
which has phosphorus bonded to oxygen and then an organic group.
Mm-hmm.
And so, some phosphorus in sort of a organic usable form seems to have been delivered to Earth.
Mm-hmm.
But you might say, okay, phosphorus is 2 times 10 to the minus 7, but in terms of living systems, zinc and manganese are also very important.
Mm-hmm.
A typical human body has like a gram of zinc,
Okay.
and zinc's even less abundant.
Right.
So it just seems that there probably was enough of phosphorus to get incorporated into living systems, and if it comes in meteorites with organic groups already attached, maybe it was just there and available.
And that's, of course, being more nuanced, people think of the life ingredients, carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen, but there's another dozen or so that
Yes.
are pretty critical for biochemistry.
Exactly.
Well, we've mentioned a couple. What
Iron, zinc, manganese, sulfur is even important, and it's important in 2 amino acids. Let's see, I said iron, cobalt, and that's probably enough off the top of my head. Calcium, potassium.
And it sort of, begs the question, which you already mentioned is one of the big unknowns in the subject of what was the pathway? You've got the table set for life, you got the basic ingredients, and then at some point, you have a cell, the simplest cells, and there's an awful lot of a gap between those two things.
Well, I think that, if organics were delivered to Earth and then they ended up on mineral clay surfaces, which a lot of people think happened, metals in the chemist sense, like iron and manganese and magnesium, that's another important one, especially ones that have these d electrons, can assemble molecules. And it might have been that, on these mineral surfaces, organic material rained down and got mixed with water and then hit the surface and things started assembling.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been experiments that show that, you can get so far with those, you can produce more complicated species. Then you have to enclose it in a membrane, and there's been some experiments that show that, under certain conditions, spontaneous membranes can form.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many gaps
Right.
in how you go from the simple things to a real living system. I mean, how did the RNA world start?
And it's historical science with the unfortunate situation that most of the evidence has been destroyed.
Yes, that is true.
But I mean, as we're educators as well as scientists, and it's a pretty big issue because in both, I'm sure in both of our experiences, there are people still pushing intelligent design or other ideas because they say you can't explain where the first cell came from, and they therefore think it's not purely natural unguided processes.
Well, I think people can form membranes and they can form bits and pieces. It's just how it all came together, and
And then
We just don't know enough.
how unique the way that it came together was. What's your gut tell you about whether having a universal toolkit, whether you would always end up with the same replicating molecule or the same?
See, I think that's just a question of what got delivered to a planet's surface.
Okay.
If the same sort of compounds did, probably the same sort of
Right.
chemistry would evolve. If something got an excess of something else, maybe
Right.
it would pick something else in the formation of DNA, for example,
Right.
or a replicating code. But probably the basic structure is the same. It's just a question of the details.
Mm-hmm. But that's actually an interesting connection to the booming exoplanet field, because I think one of the lessons of exoplanets is that their geochemical atmospheric bases might be quite diverse, and so we may have a landscape where other biochemistries could develop. It's not everything is going to look totally Earth-like down to the detail.
Yeah, and I think that one has to be open to the possibilities that, there are variations that could develop. I think, for example, there is some marine, a small animal that actually, instead of iron, uses cobalt in its in getting oxygen. So already Earth is telling us that there are some diverse things that occur. And the study of extremophiles has taught us that too, that alternative things can happen even on Earth, and then you have a different planet with a really different set of conditions. Who knows where it'll go, but the basic chemistry of carbon is the basic chemistry of carbon.
Right.
So
you do lab techniques as well, and how well is it even possible to simulate? I mean, these space environments are pretty extreme, right?
you can't simulate a space environment realistically, because the thing you can never simulate are the time scales,
Right.
which are 1 million to 10 million years in a molecular cloud, and of course the densities and the densities are so low, it's very hard to achieve even the densities in the more dense regions with the most ultra high vacuum techniques in the lab. So what we do is we make what we think molecules that might be out in space. Usually they're exotic molecules, because at least half of interstellar molecules are very reactive species that we don't find normally on Earth. They'd be more like chemical intermediates that would rapidly form something else. And what we do is we create these molecules under non-equilibrium conditions. Mm-hmm. And so we have to use weird chemistry techniques like, DC discharges, and we'll ablate metals with lasers and do kinds of things that are typical chemists wouldn't do to create these strange species. And if we can make them in sufficient concentration, then we can measure their spectrum, and then we can go to a radio telescope and see if they're out in space.
Right. So even though you have this difficulty in simulating the veracity of the space environment, it's illustrative. I mean, it drives a research agenda.
Yes.
To be able to do that kind of work.
Yes.
And what are the current hot issues in the lab work, as far as things you want to do, because they'll inform your observations?
Well, I've been very interested in molecules that contain metals, because metals are important in biology and the origin of life, and if they're all frozen into rock, contained in rocks, they're probably unavailable to form the centers of a lot of these biomolecules. And so we've been working with things with aluminum and iron, and recently we discovered the first iron-containing molecule out in space, which was iron attached to a cyanogen group, CN. And that's kind of interesting in itself.
That's all just iron, carbon, and nitrogen?
Yes, wow. And that's sort of iron. The CN group is really common out in interstellar space, and it's common in biological systems, and so finding a metal, a CN group attached to a metal was kind of interesting. And actually we've seen several of these molecules with magnesium and aluminum attached to the CN group. And now we're working on metals that are attached to, they're called metal dicarbides. And so you have a CC bond, and the metal inserts itself, and they're very reactive, and they could lead to other things, and they're very difficult to make in the lab. So that's something else we're working on. Small ligands, small groups attached to a metal is one of the big things.
And of course, the issue you alluded to of timescale being simulating cosmic timescales, that's exactly the problem the biogenesis people have too. They, however long it took on Earth, it could have been tens of millions of years or 100 million years, and they just can't really do that in a lab.
Yeah, exactly. And right. And yeah, the time scales are just completely different and the conditions. But it's very interesting because another thing we've been studying out in space is the sort of molecular life cycle. And it was always thought that, molecular clouds form molecules. When solar systems form, everything's destroyed. Star form, it blows off the material, the molecules form and circumstellar envelopes are destroyed. So every individual object, you sort of had to start with basic atoms to create chemistry. But we've actually been studying molecules in all things planetary nebula. Mm-hmm. And planetary nebula, those bright objects that look so interesting in the sky, are actually quite molecule rich. And so it's saying that molecules are surviving in extreme environments that we never thought they were in, and they probably survive as the planetary nebula diffuse into the diffuse interstellar medium and form diffuse clouds, and the diffuse clouds collapse to dense clouds, and the whole cycle sort of starts all over again. But what that's saying is that you don't ever completely destroy molecular material. And so you always have some molecules which live and can be built up to greater and greater chemical complexity. And maybe we're in the wrong part of the galaxy to see how complex the molecules can get, because galactic center's gone through more periods of star formation, and it is kind of interesting that the most interesting molecular cloud in terms of chemical complexity is the one in the galactic center.
Okay.
But anyway, it's just, timescales could be the timescales of a galaxy.
Right. But that does lead to an issue where, the planet hunters, of course, are looking,
Right.
Their holy grail is Earth-like planets around isolated sun-like stars, but maybe illuminated by your field, there are some interesting environments in which to study exoplanets. I mean, they're molecularly rich and interesting. Is it better to look in a place like Orion or Taurus or a...
Well, in terms of finding an exoplanet,
Yeah.
well, one thing about Taurus is that it's very carbon rich.
Okay.
And so that's an interesting environment.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be an interesting place to look. I don't quite know, what the basis of which they choose exoplanet.
Right. I guess it's probably just too young for them
Right.
to be getting to that.
They're probably
level.
not thinking of exactly where to look in terms of the molecular environment. They just want to detect anything,
Right.
anywhere.
Right.
So probably as time goes on, things will even probably evolve more in that direction.
Yeah. So what are the most interesting, issues in astrobiology for you? I mean, as, the parts you're intimately working with and familiar with, or even the parts you just look at as a spectator?
Well, in astrobiology, of course, I'm very interested in what was delivered to planetary surfaces and in what form. Because that could seriously, if we knew exactly what was delivered and the quantities, we might be able to find, get a better handle on how life evolved. Because right now, it's just one big soup.
Right.
And anything could be there. So,
well, and a sidebar on that then, because I don't know and the listeners may not know, this is also connected to the models of exoplanet formation and solar system formation, and they're not really that mature or sophisticated yet. How good are those models as far as predicting exoplanet system properties?
I don't think they're very good at all.
Yeah.
I think it's a very difficult problem. And they really need more observational benchmarks to refine the models. I mean, it's a model, so maybe the models are really good, but we just don't know for sure. And then if people put a variation on a model, is that variation valid? Well, we really need to improve our way we observe exoplanets, which will probably happen in the next few decades.
Oh, and then related to you were talking about where the molecules come from and the delivery mechanism, people I think are still wondering where the water, where
Yes,
Earth got its water
water
from, and where does the water come from and when? Because if water is the critical ingredient for the formation of life, the first formation.
Well, you definitely need some kind of liquid solvent, but it may not have to be water. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic. A lot of people think that the water came from comets. Because comets are so, they're icy snowballs. They're full of water, and Earth got bombarded by enough comets and was able to, and that was after everything cooled down, so the water actually could stay instead of evaporating off. So, but there are other people that think that there wasn't enough water. in comets to deliver what we have on Earth.
Right.
But, if water, life needs some kind of solvent. Water's a very good solvent, but there's been some speculation that you could have life form in something that's based on sulfuric acid.
Wow. Okay.
So you have to have a somewhat different biochemistry, because sulfuric acid's an acid, but there was some postulation of that, or formamide,
right,
as being a good solvent.
Okay, well, and then I have to ask you as a chemist, what's your thought on Titan and that as a basis for alternative biochemistry? Ethane, methane, water, ammonia, I guess.
Titan's a very carbon-rich environment because the water is frozen out, and they have methane lakes and so forth. You'd have to see if that's because it's mostly carbon and nitrogen and not a lot of oxygen. You just don't know how far the chemistry would get, or whether you'd have to go, someplace where the water got a little bit, melted, and there was some oxygen available to react with the carbon and the nitrogen. I can't say for sure, but it seems like it'd be a little tough place to form life as we know it. But maybe some alternative, except I think you probably would need oxygen.
Right. And just moving over a little to another compelling solar system target, do we know anything about what the European ocean chemistry is likely to be like? We'd obviously love to find out.
We'd love to find out. Now there's a case where there's a lot of water, but what else?
We don't know.
Yeah, I don't think we know very much.
And the experiments, I think, that are planned are not bold enough to melt through
correct.
The ice and
yes.
actually send. They're
Yes,
indirect.
They're indirect,
okay.
Measuring things off the surface.
Well, that's a good question. If you had the $1 billion check or multi-billion-dollar check to write, what mission would you fund? In astrobiology, broadly written, what mission is most interesting to you, or what's a compelling thing to do, whether it's been actually proposed or not?
Well, I really thought that it would be good to go back to Titan and land on Titan, maybe near one of these lakes, these methane lakes or ethane lakes, and bore into the surface and see what's further down.
Right.
Because there's a lot of carbon on Titan. Europa, going to Europa, there's a lot of water there, and you'd have to get underneath the surface, and that could be very difficult. So there's a lot of things you could do, but I think that going back to Titan would be pretty interesting.
And we know how to do it. I mean, these are long missions, but they're not.
Yes, they're not. That's not. They're not impossible. They're not.
Right.
And you can actually land on Titan.
Right. So astrobiology. I'm just finishing with some broader topics. Astrobiology is really nicely interdisciplinary. Is that one of the things that you like about it?
Yes, it forces you to learn about things you probably wouldn't have learned about otherwise, because you need that as part of your repertoire to how to think about things and to study other things.
So I imagine, for instance, that you would be working with or want to work with, planetary and solar system formation modelers to make sure they were chemically accurate or sophisticated in what they're doing. Is that happening? Are the models getting to that level where they can use your expertise?
I don't think they're quite there yet. I think one avenue which I'm working with is people that study meteorites. And there's two parts of meteorites. There's a soluble material, and then there's a whole lot of insoluble material, which is carbon-based. And a lot of that insoluble material contains pre-solar. They call them pre-solar grains. They're grains made in circumstellar envelopes. And so we talk a lot about how this stuff formed in circumstellar envelopes and how it got propagated out into interstellar space. And that's one connection that I've been doing for the past few years. Modelers, I probably should talk more to modelers. I've been feeling for a while they're just not quite at the level that real detailed chemical information is going to be helpful for them.
But I mean, I think the field is moving so fast. I mean, look, it's only a decade ago where, you're just detecting exoplanets, you had a mass and then maybe had a size. Now geochemists are getting into exoplanet work. I mean, they're starting to get excited about it because the level of information is getting to the point where you have to think of it that way.
Well, it's something that
So-
something that to think about in the future. I think
Yeah.
that'd be a very interesting idea. I just, haven't made that particular connection
Right.
yet. But you're right. The field is just moving like, boom.
Yeah. So last question, your gut, knowing the chemistry is out there. What is there life elsewhere? If you were placing a
think
bet,
there is.
almost certainly.
I think almost certainly.
Yeah, and probably a lot of it. Maybe not maybe not advanced life, but microbial life.
At least, I
Yeah.
mean, yes, I do think there's the chemistry is too universal, and everywhere we look, we kind of see the same sorts of things, basic things, and if it formed on this planet, and there's probably other similar planets out there, I don't see why life wouldn't form.
Which would be, it's great because it's sort of like a continuation of the Copernican revolution, just to say, the universe is built for life with the chemistry and the environments and the energy sources, so you wouldn't be surprised, therefore, to see it detected.
No, I wouldn't. In fact, I would be very surprised if it wasn't detected.
Right.
So that means there's a lot of work to be done in astrobiology
Yeah.
for, I don't know, centuries probably.
Right.
It's a very, very exciting field, and it really attacks probably our most fundamental question that is given to science, which is, how did life evolve? Where did
Right.
it come from?
Right. And are we alone? Yeah.
Yes, and are we alone?
Okay.
So-
Thanks very much, Lucy.
Thank you.